The cold air of the nursing home's hallways seemed to bite through my uniform as I stepped into the dimly lit room. I wasn't sure if it was just the nervous energy of my first real night shift, or something more unsettling, but there was a heaviness in the air. That night, something lingered, an energy I couldn't explain. I had just begun my career as a certified nursing assistant when I first encountered the unknown. I remember that night vividly. It was the fourth night of my training, and I was on the graveyard shift, a shift that seemed to stretch on forever, wrapping the building in an eerie silence. My trainer, Amy, had warned me about the odd hours, how it could feel like you were the only living beings in the building. Little did I know that night, I would learn what true isolation felt like. It was just after 2 a.m. when the first death I'd ever witnessed occurred. A patient named Laura, an elderly woman whose family had said their goodbyes earlier in the evening, had finally passed. Amy, with her years of experience, calmly walked me through the process, explaining what we needed to do. She assured me that the deceased were nothing to fear. They were just people like us. But as she spoke those words, something felt off. We started by cleaning Laura's body, washing her as though she was still alive, brushing her hair and meticulously cleansing her skin with warm water and soap. The air in the room felt unnervingly still, as if time itself had come to a halt. Then, Amy instructed me to retrieve the body bag from the storage room at the end of the hallway. I didn't know it then, but that simple task would alter my perception of reality forever. I walked down the darkened hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting long, unsettling shadows along the walls. The place was empty, save for the distant sound of a television in one of the patient rooms. As I reached the storage room and opened the door, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the dimly lit room, was an elderly woman. She was dressed in a faded blue dress, with a white cloth tied under her chin and atop her head, just like the one we had just used to secure Laura's mouth. The woman's eyes were fixed on me, her expression blank, almost as if she was waiting. She handed me the body bag without a word, and I, in a daze, took it. The chill of her touch still lingers in my memory, but it was the eerie calmness of her presence that I couldn't shake. I walked back to Laura's room, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I did. When I returned to Amy, I didn't mention the woman. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to say anything. We finished our task in silence, preparing Laura for the morgue. Amy tied the same white cloth under Laura's chin, securing it tightly. I asked her about the cloth, wondering why it was necessary. Amy's explanation was simple. It kept the mouth closed. But my mind couldn't let go of the woman in the storage room. Who was she? Why did she look so familiar? The cloth she wore, the same one Amy had just tied to Laura's head, it all felt too strange, too much like déjà vu. When the morgue transporter arrived and took Laura's body away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Amy and I went to the break room for lunch, but I could hardly eat. I had to ask Amy about the woman I'd seen. My voice shook as I explained what happened, telling her about the woman in the storage room. Amy paused, a curious look crossing her face. Then with a laugh she explained, "Oh, you must have seen Sally." Sally. The name sent a shiver down my spine. Amy explained that Sally used to work the night shift as a CNA for nearly 30 years, until she was diagnosed with breast cancer. After battling the disease, Sally ended up in the very hospice care she had once worked for. She passed away 6 years ago. But Amy wasn't done. She said some of the night staff still saw Sally, in the parking lot or walking the darkened hallways. "Don't worry," Amy said with a reassuring smile. "She doesn't hurt anyone." The words echoed in my mind as I processed what she'd said. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Amy added, "I was the one who took care of Sally when she passed. I even tied that cloth around her head just like I did for Laura. I sat there in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The woman I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was Sally, the ghost of a CNA who had passed away long ago, still roaming the halls of the nursing home she had once called home. The following weeks became a blur of patients, night shifts, and that lingering sense of being watched. I would occasionally catch glimpses of her, Sally, out of the corner of my eye. A flash of blue in the hallway, a shadow lingering by the break room door. But each time, when I turned to look, she was gone. And though Amy assured me that Sally meant no harm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in the air had changed. The nursing home, once a place of routine and calm, had turned into something darker, something filled with the echoes of lives past. I'll never forget that night, the night I encountered Sally, because in that moment I understood. Some spirits don't leave. They stay, bound to the places they once worked, watching over the living, or perhaps waiting for something more. And I wonder, am I the next one who will stay behind? It was 3 a.m. when I heard her voice again, the same voice that had haunted me for weeks after she passed away. It called out to me, soft but desperate, I'm hurting. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Her voice had been a constant presence in the nursing home, but this time it was different. It was no longer the frail call of a patient who needed assistance. It was the voice of someone lost, trapped between worlds. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mai, and I used to work as a certified nursing assistant at a small nursing home, a place where the veil between life and death is thin, so thin, in fact, that you could almost feel the breath of the departed lingering in the air. Many of us who work in these places experience strange and unexplainable things. It's not just the grief or the weariness that comes with tending to the elderly. It's something else, something you can't quite explain but feel deep in your bones. This particular nursing home had seen its fair share of deaths, but one patient in particular stayed with me long after she was gone. She was an elderly woman transferred from the hospital because of severe pressure ulcers on her buttocks. The wounds were so bad that the hospital had already filed a case with Adult Protective Services. They were looking into the family's neglect, the kind that comes from not properly caring for a bedridden person, the kind that results in the skin breaking down, becoming raw and infected, because the patient had been left to lie in urine and feces for days at a time. When the hospital admitted her, I could see the signs of neglect. I wasn't shocked, but it saddened me deeply. Her name was never clear to me. She was just Granny in my mind. Granny's family never visited much. When they did, it was always a brief stop, a quick goodbye. The woman was paralyzed on one side of her body from a stroke, and though she could feed herself with her right hand, she needed help with everything else. Changing clothes, bathing, cleaning up, and every time she needed something, she wouldn't press the red call button like most patients. "No," she called out to me instead, her voice shaking with desperation. "Mai, I'm hurting. Mai, come help me." It was always the same. Night after night, I'd help her. I'd turn her, clean her, dress her, anything to ease her discomfort. I'd always reassure her that she wasn't alone. But then, one day, the inevitable happened. Granny passed away. After only 7 months in our care, her body finally gave out. That night, her family came in droves to dress her in traditional funeral attire. They made sure she looked presentable, just like they always do. But none of them seemed to acknowledge how seldom they'd visited her during her final days. It was the Thursday after Granny's passing when something happened that I couldn't explain. It was 8:30 p.m., and my shift was nearly over. I had put all my patients to bed and was on my lunch break. But when I returned to check on my patients, I found them all sleeping soundly. The nurse at the station, her face pale, looked at me with wide eyes. "I swear I heard Granny calling for you," she said, her voice trembling. I brushed it off, thinking she was just tired, maybe imagining things. But the nurse wasn't joking. She showed me her arms, covered in goosebumps, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. "Don't worry about it," I told her. "We're used to hearing Granny's calls." But even as I spoke, I knew something wasn't right. That night, my shift ended at 11 p.m. I finished my report to the next CNA and left the building, walking to the parking lot. The nursing home sat near a large grape farm, and it was quiet. Too quiet. I was alone, my footsteps echoing in the cold night air. As I reached my car and began to unlock the door, I heard it. The voice, faint but unmistakable. I'm hurting." I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart leaped into my throat, but I shook it off. I must have imagined it. It was the stress, the long hours. But then, I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation that started at the back of my neck and spread down my spine, as if ants were crawling all over me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. I rushed into my car, locking the door behind me, trying to shake off the fear clawing at my chest. But the entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still with me. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't want to scare them. But the next morning, my mother looked at me, her face pale and wide-eyed. "Both your father and I heard a woman's voice calling your name last night outside the house." That's when I told her. I told her about the voice in the parking lot, about how I had heard Granny's cry once more. My mother, always the believer in the supernatural, didn't hesitate. Maybe she didn't realize she had passed away. Maybe she's still lingering, following you home because the funeral hasn't happened yet. And that night, as strange as it was, I didn't hear anything. The house was quiet. It was as if Granny had finally moved on. The funeral was held that weekend, and with it, the lingering presence seemed to vanish. But even now, years later, I can't forget the feeling, the way Granny's voice called to me from the darkness. I know it's not just me who's felt it. Many of the nurses and doctors I worked with have their own stories. Long-term nursing homes are a last stop for many patients, but they also seem to be a place where the spirits of the departed sometimes linger, not quite ready to let go. As far as I know, these spirits never hurt anyone, but every now and then you can hear their cries, begging for help. The night was unusually quiet when I first heard the call light flicker on. At first I thought it was just another malfunction, a common nuisance in the nursing home. But as I walked down the dimly lit hallway, a chill ran down my spine. The room was empty, yet the call light in room 12 blared, insistent, demanding attention. Frank's room. Frank was dead. He had been rushed to the hospital hours ago after suddenly vomiting blood. One moment he was sitting out on the patio enjoying his usual cigarette. The next, he was fighting for his life. And now, he was gone. The paramedics had taken him away, and I had assumed the room would be quiet for the night. But that call light, blinking in the darkness, had a different story to tell. As I approached room 12, the air felt heavier, colder. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The door creaked open, but there was no one inside. No Frank. Just the emptiness of a room once filled with the presence of someone who had lived there for years. His things were still in place, but there was no sign of life. I turned off the call light and walked back to the nurse's station, shaking my head. But then it happened again. The light blinked on, even though there was no one there. I told myself it was just a faulty wire, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling up my neck. Lisa, the nurse on shift, was just as puzzled. "Who's in room 12? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. I made my way back to the room, fully expecting nothing. But when I opened the door, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. The room was as empty as before, but the light was still on, stubbornly blinking in the silence. I turned it off again and left, but it flickered back on. I returned. It went off. I walked away. It flickered again. This went on for what felt like forever until I couldn't ignore it any longer. "You go do it," I told one of the other CNAs. By now, Lisa had grown concerned. She picked up the phone and called the hospital, asking for an update on Frank's condition. The response made my stomach turn. Frank had died around 7:30 p.m. that evening, yet his light still flickered on. We couldn't explain it. No one could. And the strange occurrences didn't stop there. As the night wore on, the light continued to blink in room 12, calling to us in the dark like some unseen force was trying to make contact. But it wasn't until the third time that we couldn't ignore it any longer. I went into the room with Lisa, the nurse, both of us standing in the eerily silent room. "Frank," Lisa said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "you're no longer living here. Please go be with God. You don't belong here anymore." And just like that, the light went off. We both stood there for a long moment, breathless, unsure of what had just happened. But something had shifted in the air. We felt it. Whatever was lingering in that room, whether it was Frank's spirit or something else, had finally moved on, or so we thought. Even now, when I work late shifts, I hear whispers about the shadowy figure seen sitting outside in the dark, by the patio where Frank used to smoke. Sometimes staff members swear they see him, sitting motionless in the dark as if waiting for something, waiting for someone. It's the kind of thing that doesn't surprise me anymore. Nursing homes are often the last stop for many, and once someone lives there long enough, some of them don't seem to leave. Their bodies may be gone, but their presence lingers, haunting the halls, the rooms, even the dark corners of the patio. And sometimes it's not just the patients who stay. Sometimes it's the ones who cared for them too, left behind to watch, to listen, and to feel the chill that never really goes away. It was late, the nursing home quiet, and I was making my rounds. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was about to check on the last patient of my shift when something strange caught my attention. I paused, standing in the hallway, frozen by a feeling I couldn't shake, a sensation like someone was watching me. I looked down the long corridor where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper. "Help me." I turned around, heart pounding in my chest. No one was there, but I just knew it was him. The man I had cared for, the one who'd passed away 7 months ago. Let me start from the beginning. I work as a CNA in a facility that has 2 wings, one for short-term rehab, where patients come to recover and then go home, and the other, the long-term care wing. The long-term side is, for lack of a better word, a place where people go to wait out the end of their lives. It's a harsh truth, but it's one you learn to live with when you're working in this field. One patient in particular stood out. A 58-year-old man sent from the hospital after his family could no longer care for him at home. He had suffered a stroke, which left him paralyzed, unable to do anything for himself. His family tried, but with kids at school and his wife working, there was no one to help him. He often found himself lying in his own waste, helpless. His skin was raw, infected from the lack of care. His family made the hard decision to place him in the nursing facility, where he could be properly looked after. I took care of him during my shifts. He couldn't talk, could barely move, and had to be fed through a tube. It was heartbreaking. His wife visited almost every day, sitting by his side, and I remember her telling me the story of their daughter, C. She was attending university a couple of hours away and drove a beat-up old Honda Accord. On one scorching afternoon, the father went out to put oil in her car when the stroke hit him, taking him down in the driveway. His family had no idea. By the time they found him, it was too late. His body never recovered. His wife and daughter were devastated, of course. His daughter C was especially kind. She would visit him, bringing him books and talking to him, though he couldn't respond. It was clear how much she loved him. I spoke with her a few times, and she seemed like such a strong person, even in the face of such loss. A year later, the patient passed away from a severe blood infection. The wounds on his body, particularly on his backside, would get infected because of his lack of mobility. Bacteria entered his bloodstream, and eventually, it was too much for his body to fight off. He died in the hospital. His daughter C texted me the news. She was crying, grief pouring out through every word. It's not unusual to see patients pass in a nursing home. Death becomes a constant presence, a part of the job. But there was something about this man's death that lingered. 7 months later, on one quiet evening shift, I was finishing up my rounds when I heard it again. The whisper. Help me. This time I couldn't ignore it. I walked down the hallway toward his old room, room 12. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been when he'd lived there. I pushed it open, expecting the stillness of an empty room, but instead, I was met with an overwhelming sense of him. It felt like he was still there, watching me. I stood frozen, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd always known something wasn't quite right with that place. The long-term wing where death hangs in the air, where spirits linger, and where the echoes of the past refuse to fade. Sometimes the other staff would talk about hearing strange noises, seeing shadows move in empty rooms, or feeling cold spots when the heating was running fine. But this was different. The voice kept calling out in my mind, "Help me." The same words his family had said when he was still alive, helpless and in pain. But now, it wasn't just a memory. It was like he was still trapped in that moment, unable to leave. I told no one. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the job, or something more sinister, but every time I went into that hallway I could feel it, the weight of something watching me. Things didn't stop there. I continued my work, but every time I entered room 12, the hairs on the back of my neck would rise. It was like he was still there, waiting for someone to listen, to help. And the worst part. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear his wife's voice echoing through the halls, as though she was still searching for him. I never spoke to C again after that day she texted me. I didn't want to tell her that the spirit of her father might still be there, still wandering the nursing home, still trapped in the place where his life ended. Would she believe me? Or would she think I was just another overworked CNA losing my mind? Maybe I imagined it all. But every night, when the shadows grow long and the air turns cold, I still hear the whispers, faint but clear. Help me. It's not easy working in a place like this, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, where the past clings to the walls, refusing to let go. But I've learned one thing. The spirits don't always leave. Sometimes they stay, and sometimes they're still waiting for help. It was a late, quiet night, and I was driving back home after visiting my boyfriend in a city hours away. The trip was always long, but tonight it felt different, uneasy. My boyfriend, who usually made the trip to see me, was stuck at home with car problems, so I drove alone. After dinner and a movie, I waved him goodbye, and with a sigh, I set off for the long drive back. But something was wrong. From the very start, my car felt sluggish, like it was fighting to keep moving. It sputtered, jerking as I stepped on the gas. The engine, which usually hummed quietly, now groaned in resistance. A cold shiver crept up my spine as the car struggled to gain speed, and with each press of the pedal, it barely responded. I thought I might make it home, but as I passed through a small cowboy town, my car gave one last violent shake before slowing to a crawl. Fear gripped me. The road stretched out before me, lonely and empty. My car was barely moving, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night terrified me. I pulled over to the side, hoping it was just a glitch, but when I turned off the engine, it refused to start again. I dialed my boyfriend, even though I knew he wouldn't be able to help. He was always the last to sleep, waiting for me to get home safely. He reassured me he'd come right away with his older brother, even though neither of them knew much about cars. I sat there in silence, wondering if I had enough gas or if something more sinister was happening. My thoughts raced as I tried to think logically, checking the temperature gauge to see if I had run out of coolant. I noticed headlights in the distance, 2 cars driving toward me. The moment they passed, I got out and opened the hood, shining my flashlight on the engine. To my surprise, the coolant level seemed fine, but something still felt off. I was about to get back in the car when I felt it, an icy chill. It was as if someone had just slid into the car beside me. The whole vehicle shuddered and I froze, terrified. I quickly stepped back, my heart racing, and shined the light through the window. Nothing. But then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it, a shadow, just for a second, moving in the seat. My breath caught in my throat. My legs trembled as I backed away slowly, and just as I turned to run, the hood slammed shut by itself. The car shook again, violently. I didn't even think. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked all the doors. My hands shook as I inserted the key and twisted. To my shock, the car started right up. No sputtering, no hesitation, like nothing had ever happened. With my heart pounding, I drove away, almost desperate to put the incident behind me. After about 20 minutes, I pulled into a gas station and called my boyfriend to let him know I was fine. No need for him to come anymore. I reassured him I'd be home in about an hour. I thought I'd shaken off the fear, but it lingered in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I had a dream. It was so vivid. I was at work feeding an elderly patient when a man I used to care for appeared. He handed me a car key and said, "Your spark plugs are old and not working well. You need to change them." I took the key from him and then I woke up, heart racing, the dream fresh in my mind. I didn't think much of it, but later, when I mentioned the problem to my older sister's boyfriend, he said he'd take a look at the car. After a quick drive around the block, he diagnosed the issue. It was the spark plugs. He explained that the plugs were worn out and not sparking properly, which was causing the car to stall. I had never even heard of spark plugs, but when he fixed them, my car ran perfectly. I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream. The man I cared for, the one who had passed away, had come to me in my time of need. Was it just a coincidence? Or did he really reach out from the other side to help me? I'll never know for sure, but the thought of it brings me both comfort and dread. It was an experience I'll never forget.